Welcome to the CXR channel, our premier podcast for talent acquisition and talent management. Listen in as the CXR community discusses a wide range of topics focused on attracting, engaging, and retaining the best talent. We're glad you're here.
Hey everyone, welcome to the CXR podcast. I am Lars Schmidt, and I am the new managing director of the talent management community within CXR. And I'm thrilled to be joined on the podcast today by my good friend, Chris Hoyt. Chris, how you doing, buddy?
Good, Lars. Always excited to do a quick podcast with you. These are always fun.
Yeah, these are fun. So these are little quickies. Chris and I like to get together and just have a bit of a riff on a topic. And so each week when we bring you these, are going to be small, snackable podcasts where both Chris and I will kind of weigh in on something that is front of mind for us and probably front of mind for others. Hopefully front of mind for others.
Yeah.
So today we're going to be talking about really what I kind of view as holistic talent management. And that's the idea of really looking at end-to-end process with it relates to kind of integrating recruiting within HR and talent management and really all aspects of the, prospect through employee life cycle. And I think the idea for this podcast came for us. One of these days, Chris and I were having a conversation over beverages of some sort. You can imagine what those might be. And
it's a shocker we might be having a nice discussion with some social lubrication.
That might be a through line for some of these episodes. I think it's possible, but let's we could go way off track with that. I'm going to keep us focused. But we were talking about just that and kind of whether recruiting should sit in HR and talent management. And I painfully shared an old story of mine where I remember distinctly I was a director of recruiting at a company I shall not name to protect the company and myself. But I was in a meeting and there's probably a happy hour actually, and somebody made the comment that you always hear if you're in HR. Oh, look out, HR is here, yada yada. Don't want to say that. And my response without even thinking was, actually, I'm in recruiting. We're the Green Berets of HR. And I say that now, like I'm outing myself, right? I said that. I still carry the shame from that conversation at that moment. But I was young and I was naive. And frankly, I was dumb. I didn't really have a broad enough view as to really how I could have the most impact as a recruiting leader. And I'm curious, Chris, you've sat in that seat before. What is your view on kind of the connection and how recruiting fits into the broader HR and talent management landscape?
For years, it's always been sort of an interesting debate as to, where should recruiting shit.
That debate has been raging for years.
I think that's one we're just going to flush. We can remove that completely. For years, it's been a debate, I think, with regards to where recruiting should sit. And there's often been some discussion, right? Does it go in operations? Does it sit outside of HR? Does it sit within HR? Does it directly report into, the CHRO or a subset of that? And I think it's sort of been a really interesting mix to watch as different organizations structure it differently. I don't know that there is necessarily, or that I feel necessarily strong enough one way or the other, as long as I think that, that structure works for the function and works for the company that it's within.
Yeah, I think that's a great point. And that, that really should be something that can be applied to almost anything we talk about or anything you read about or anything an analyst tells you should be doing. You always have to calibrate what you hear locally. And that's why I never use the term best practice. I don't like the term best practice. There's too many it's too subjective. There's too many variables that allow that practice to be a best practice in that particular company. And so, the idea of treating those things as absolutes is the wrong way to go.
The term I enjoy is competitive practice.
Yeah.
And I really do think, and at CXR we do an awful lot of benchmarking, and I think it's with over 100 plus companies to be able to really see where an organization sits and how it measures up among peers, and it does help, I think, a company to see that they're not quite as far behind or they're not quite as far ahead as they thought they were. But I will tell you, and I've said this for years, I think the best thing or the best benchmark an organization could do is absolutely against itself.
Yeah.
And I think that's the same for structure. There is some flexibility there in terms of, where does where does HR end and TA begin, or where does TA end and TM begin?
Yeah. Yeah, and I think another term that I know we used a lot with HR open source was proven practices, right? So
Mhm.
we're just kind of saying, hey, this is something that has worked in this one situation. Doesn't mean it's going to work for you. Maybe it will, maybe it won't. A verbatim copy probably won't, but you need to tweak that for kind of all of your own variables. I think for me, like when I think about how recruiting sits into it, one of the things that worries me about the landscape today is I think companies are, we haven't given up on this zombie notion of the war for talent, right? Like it's a phrase that won't
I
die.
hate that
I
phrase. I
hate it.
hate
I
that
hate it, but
phrase.
it's not going. I've given up. I was like, we can eradicate it. Like it can happen in my lifetime, but now I'm not so sure.
I
Um,
think the war is on the war is on the phrase "the war for talent."
I'd fight that war. I would sign up. Draft me in that war. I'm game. But I think we get so hooked on that idea, and so companies are investing incredibly heavily on the recruiting side, which is a recruiter. Sure, that's
Mhm.
great. Like that fires me up. But I think that companies are really being a bit short sighted when they're not matching that investment and that effort and those resources on retention, and how are they actually creating an environment that is sticky and holds on to those people once you've worked so hard to find them. And that to me is really the big kind of where the idea that recruiting should be a standalone thing, where that argument falls flat for me. Because if as a recruiter,
Mhm.
if you don't understand what is going to happen to that hire once you've brought them into the organization, then you're not going to be as effective as you could be as a recruiter. And so that to me is just the biggest shortcoming with the notion that recruiting should be completely separate.
Yeah, I'll tell you an interesting aspect for me is really understanding what happens to the talent after it comes in, and the easiest highlight there is of course when pre-boarding starts, if it starts at most organizations, or where onboarding, who owns the onboarding and where that gets picked
Yeah.
up, and then I think that just moves so nicely into obviously talent development, right? But then you've also got this big topic, which I think is going to continue to rise up, bubble up, and just be more and more on the front of everybody's mind. And this is talent mobility.
Yeah.
And for years, we have been talking about the candidate experience for external candidates. And we've been talking about how we spend, some organizations spending over $1 million to revamp their career site, revamp these gateways or strategy pages or videos that are all geared towards bringing in or attracting that talent. But then once folks are in the organization, talent acquisition sort of hands off. And so what does the employee get? Well, they get the out of the box, quite horrible solution that usually comes from an ATS in terms of trying to figure out what jobs are available and what jobs might they be a match for, and how do they find these. And unfortunately, for years we've just sort of swept that under the premise of, well, once you're here, you get to manage your own career. It's on you to figure out where you want to go next. And I just feel like that's such a huge miss. And we're going to see more organizations taking that internal candidate experience, that talent mobility element, very, very seriously. And I think that sits nicely with talent management.
Yeah, I think it's a really important point, because when you think of the amount of time and effort you invest in bringing people into the organization, if you're not, again, most companies aren't, you're not matching that with trying to proactively create internal opportunities for growth and development, people are going to leave. And the challenge is, especially when you mention those kind of out of the box approaches, like, here, we have an internal career site for you. Like, yeah, that's our answer. And like, cool. So when I apply, you're gonna have a little house icon next to my name, and I'm not gonna get any different treatment than an external candidate. And I think that the risk is, once you've put somebody in a position where you've put one of your employees in a position that they've entertained the idea of leaving. They've responded to
Mm-hmm.
that recruiter in mail. They've taken the step to see, okay, what might my life be like after this? Like, that's a genie you can't put back in the bottle. And I think that that's a real challenge when you're not really proactive. Really, like, one of the things I'm excited about this year is to start to find more examples of companies that are doing an incredible job of re-recruiting their talent. Yeah,
Mm-hmm.
and do anyone,
Yeah,
like,
I
what comes
think
to mind for you when you think of? I know you've got an incredible portfolio of companies in the CXR, network. What does anything stand out to you in terms of companies that are finding ways to really kind of put that as a focal point of their talent strategy?
Yeah, in fact, in just the last two meetings that we've done, we did executive recruiting, where we had about 39 companies that were present at that particular meeting. And then we did sourcing, where we had 48 companies that were present. And in both of those, the topic of recruiting and sourcing talent internally was a discussion. Now, a year ago, that everybody sort of blew that off as, well, our culture doesn't allow for that, or, oh, it'll be such a culture shift for us to try to recruit internally. Our directors aren't ready to give up their talent. I'm using air quotes here for
Right.
their talent, right? Because it's not really the director's talent; it's the company's talent. But I think in the last year, we've really seen some of those organizations grab hold of that idea of recruiting internally and realize we have historically made it so much easier for people to find promotions, find jobs outside of the organization, and done just such a disservice, culturally as well as monetarily, right, from a budget standpoint, of letting those people leave and having to start all over. And so it was really, really interesting the last two meetings to hear of at least 3 or 4 companies that have now already created internal recruiting teams, and that are working and socializing with stakeholders within those organizations to say, you know, you really do want your talent to get a call from a recruiter that's our own versus a call from a recruiter that is outside the
Yeah,
company.
no, that's a great point. And I vividly remember getting into heated arguments when I was running kind of in-house recruiting teams with hiring managers that were very kind of, and I get where this comes from, but they were very territorial around their talent. They didn't want anybody talking to their people. They didn't want to, lose them after, they want to try to put kind of artificial timelines around. Okay, well, they have to be in the role for 3 years before they could get. So I'm just like,
Uh,
what, look, I get it. It sucks to lose good people, and you work really hard to find talent, and it sucks to lose talent. But
yeah.
like, the company's gonna lose them. Like, it's not just you. Like, the organization's like, they're not gonna, especially now. It's like 3 years. People aren't gonna sit in the same job for 3 years. And yeah,
Well,
go ahead.
yeah, sorry, Lars. I was gonna say, look, I remember, and I still do to some level. I don't know about the timeline, but I used to subscribe to this. Look, it really is the first year in the role. It really is getting to understand the job, and the second year in the role is really, really becoming a master of that craft, really mastering that role, and then that third year is the year that you just put your fingerprints all over it, right? You're making big changes and you're shifting things around, and you're really making it your own. I don't think that that's the timeline anymore. I think things move much more quickly. And I also think, we're making a lot more hires, I think, of folks who've just got a learning agility across the board that makes a big difference and helps to speed some of that up. But that might also be my own evolution in learning that, 3 years might have just been dumb. And that might have just been something that, I grew up with and that I was, then putting on my people when I was a TA later. But I think to your point, 3 years is an awfully long time to expect somebody to hang around anymore. And we've got to focus on giving them development opportunities and challenges a little bit faster than that. We've got
Yeah,
to
and I
push
think
that.
one of the companies that I think does a really good job of this is LinkedIn. They had rolled out their kind of tour of duty, idea where if you get hired into a role, and the idea is that I might be butchering this a little bit, so I'll have to get the actual facts later to update. But my understanding of it is, you're basically hired into a role, and it's kind of a 2-year agreement. And the idea is like, you're here for 2 years. Here's what you're going to do. Here's what we expect from you. Here's what we're going to provide to you in terms of growth and development and skills. At the end of that 2 years, you have a conversation with your boss. Is this still the right place for you? Do you want to go somewhere else in the company? Do you want to
Mhm.
go somewhere else outside of the company? And they're very open about that level of conversation. And to me, that's really practical when you think about it. I mean, a two-year investment, that is, especially in the valley, that's the average tenure for employees. I think that's a realistic time frame. And
Yeah.
then when you're able to have that conversation up front, right at the moment you're hired, hey, here's your deal. This is a 2-year job. And maybe after 2 years, you're going to want to do this again, or do more of this, or do a version of this. Maybe you're going to want to go somewhere else. So we have a track record of being able to put people in very different roles within the company once they've been here. We know what they can produce for us, and maybe you'll go elsewhere, and that might be the right answer too. But I think that it's setting a different tone for the relationship with the employee that is much more um, candid and upfront, and frankly, I think sets both parties up for better success.
Yeah, I think if you're one of those organizations that's still dealing with phrases like time and title and time and grade, it's probably time to reevaluate that, right, and take another look. And I also think, and we've seen this in the last couple of years too, and I think it's very, very powerful when we're talking about this at the senior manager up to associate director level. But are these project teams, right? These larger project teams, and grouping these guys together in squads, if you will. To do some really neat work that's just outside of the scope of immediate responsibility. And I think that's just a great way to flex, get these guys working together and really flex some muscles that they wouldn't typically get to use as they're either just, leading recs or leading and managing recruiters.
I think you're right. And I think this is a topic that we could probably spend hours on, but we're going to stay true to the format of our podcast and keep this one snackable. But I imagine this is going to be one of probably a series where we're definitely be going deeper in this, because there's so much to it. And I think particularly when you look across the CXR community, there's so many companies that are really taking different approaches towards how they solve this problem. And so that's going to really help us identify more stories and trends and examples that we could bring to listeners to help them get an idea of what are other options, what are different things they might be able to do.
Yeah. And I mean, you and China have a really great session coming up, I think in December, where you guys are really going to talk about the, workforce requirements and how they're changing as a result of, technology and generational shifts and globalization. And I just think that that's going to be a tremendous opportunity to talk about what's currently working with other companies, not just you in China, obviously, but what's currently working, but that won't be working soon. And what might be effective in the coming months and the years, and then just really, ideally to do a bit of a brainstorming piece and try to solve that talent puzzle a little bit. Notice I didn't say war on talent.
Thank you. You can say a war on war for talent. So that may be a new phrase that we've coined that both Chris and Lars wholly endorse.
Thanks, Lars.
So, all right, Chris. Well, this is fun. We're gonna be back with more of these, and I'm excited to see what else we can come up with.
Good stuff. I'll talk to you on the next podcast.
Thanks for listening to the CXR channel. Please subscribe to CXR on your favorite podcast resource and leave us a review while you're at it. Learn more about CXR at our website, cxr.works, facebook.com and twitter.com/careercrossroads, and on Instagram @careerxroads. We'll catch you next time.